In 1958, a man named Earl Wilcox walked out of the Clearwater National Forest in Idaho for the last time. He was 53 years old. He'd spent 31 of those years felling timber with a crosscut saw and a double-bit axe. His hands were permanently curved from gripping handles. His shoulders were uneven from decades of pulling a 7-foot blade through Douglas fir. He could read a tree the way you read a sentence, knew by the sound of the wood whether it would fall clean or twist and kill him. That morning, a 24-year-old kid with a McCulloch chainsaw cut down more timber in 3 hours than Earl could fell in a day. Earl didn't say much. He packed his gear, walked to his truck, and drove home to a wife who'd been waiting 31 years for him to come back whole. He never returned to the woods. This is the story of what happened when machines replace men in the American forest. Not gradually, not gently, but in a single generation. 5,000 loggers vanished from the woods of the Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes between 1945 and 1970. Most of them are gone now. The youngest would be in their 80s. But the forests remember, and so do the towns they left behind. If you're over 60, you might remember this. You might have watched your father or your grandfather walk away from the only work he'd ever known. You might have seen the crosscut saws end up in barns, then antique shops, then museums. You might still have one rusting in your garage, and you might not be able to explain why you've never thrown it away. Let me tell you about the world those men built, and the world that replaced them. Before the machines came, logging was a partnership between men and trees. I don't mean that romantically. I mean it literally. A hand logger didn't overpower a tree. He understood it. He negotiated with it. He read its lean, its weight, its internal tensions, and he used that knowledge to bring it down exactly where he wanted it to fall. The crosscut saw was the tool of this negotiation. 2 men, one on each end, pulling a blade 6 to 8 feet long through wood that could be 6 feet in diameter. The rhythm was everything. You didn't push. You pulled. Your partner pulled. Back and forth, 100 strokes a minute, hour after hour, the kerf deepening, the sawdust piling up in golden mounds that smelled like nothing else on earth. There was a language to the work that outsiders never heard. The sawyers had signals, grunts and nods and shifts in rhythm that communicated everything they needed to say without wasting breath on words. A slight hesitation meant slow down. A quick pull meant speed up. A sudden stop meant danger. Get clear, something's wrong with the tree. The saw itself was a precision instrument, though it didn't look like one. Each tooth was filed to a specific angle, the rakers set to a specific depth. A well-maintained crosscut could slice through old-growth fir, like it was butter. A poorly maintained one would bind and jump and tear the wood instead of cutting it. The difference was the sharpener, usually the oldest man in camp, whose eyes might be failing but whose hands remembered every angle, every bevel, every variation in steel. Sharpening a crosscut saw took 2 hours of concentrated work. The sharpener would clamp the blade in a wooden vise, run his fingers along the teeth to feel for damage, then begin the slow process of filing each tooth individually. There were different patterns for different woods, different settings for winter and summer. Knowledge that took years to acquire and couldn't be learned from a book. That knowledge is gone now. There might be a dozen people left in America who can properly sharpen a crosscut saw. When they die, that skill dies with them. A good sawyer team could feel the tree beginning to go before they heard it. The tension in the wood changed. The saw moved differently. And then came the call that echoed through every logging camp in America for 100 years. Timber. Not shouted in panic, but called out like a prayer, a warning, a farewell. The tree would groan. It would crack. It would lean, impossibly slow at first, then faster, faster, until it hit the ground with a sound that shook the earth and sent every bird within a mile into the sky. And then, silence. The sawyers would stand there, breathing hard, looking at what they'd done, a tree that had been growing since before the Revolutionary War, lying on its side, ready to become houses and ships and railroad ties. This was the work. This was the life. The men who did it came from everywhere. Scandinavians who'd grown up with axes in their hands, whose fathers and grandfathers had cleared forests in the old country. French Canadians who'd worked the rivers of Quebec and knew how to read water the way other men read roads. Farm boys from Minnesota and Wisconsin who needed winter work when the fields lay frozen. Immigrants from every country in Europe who'd heard that a strong back could earn good money in the American woods. They lived in camps that were temporary cities, bunkhouses with 100 men sleeping on wooden bunks, their wet wool socks hanging from every rafter, their boots lined up by the stove to dry, cookhouses that served 4,000 calories a day because the work burned every one of them. Blacksmith shops where the saws were sharpened and the axes were ground, the ring of hammer on steel starting before dawn and continuing into the night. Stables for the horses and later the oxen that would drag the logs to the rivers. The smell of those camps stayed with men for the rest of their lives. Wood smoke and pine pitch and horse manure and wet wool and strong coffee, and the particular odor of 100 men who bathed once a week if they were lucky. Veterans of those camps, interviewed in their 80s and 90s, would close their eyes and describe that smell in perfect detail. They could still feel the heat of the bunkhouse stove, still hear the snoring and coughing and muttering of men sleeping the sleep of total exhaustion. The work started before dawn and ended after dark. In winter, in the northern camps, that meant 16-hour days in darkness, working by lantern light, the temperature 20 below zero, the snow waist-deep. Men lost fingers to frostbite. They lost hands to saws. They lost their lives to falling trees and rolling logs, and the 1,000 other ways the forest could kill you. A study of logging camps in Wisconsin between 1880 and 1920 found that 1 in 4 workers was seriously injured every season. 1 in 50 died. Those aren't statistics. Those are fathers and sons and brothers who went into the woods and never came home. Those are women who became widows at 30, children who grew up without fathers, families that never recovered from a knock on the door and a foreman holding his hat in his hands. The injuries were brutal in their variety: crushed legs from rolling logs, severed fingers from slipping axes, broken backs from falls, puncture wounds from cant hooks, internal injuries from being caught between a tree and the ground. The camp doctor, if there was one, could set bones and stitch wounds. But anything serious meant a trip to town that might take days. Bouncing in a wagon over logging roads that were little more than mud tracks through the forest. Men died from injuries that would be minor today simply because help was too far away. And the trees themselves were killers. A widowmaker was a dead branch hung up in the canopy, invisible from below, waiting to fall when the vibration of sawing shook it loose. A barber chair was a tree that split vertically as it fell, sending half the trunk kicking backward toward the sawyers at lethal speed. A school marm was a tree with a double trunk that could go either direction when it fell, unpredictable and deadly. The old sawyers knew these dangers by name because they'd seen men die from each one. They passed the knowledge down, one generation to the next, and that knowledge kept people alive. Not always. What was something in them that needed to test was something in them that needed to test itself against something bigger than itself. They went because their fathers had gone, and their grandfathers, and because logging was what men like them did. And they built America. That's not an exaggeration. The houses of the eastern cities were built from white pine cut in Michigan and floated down the rivers to Chicago. The railroad ties that connected the coasts were cut from forests in Oregon and Washington. The ships that carried American goods around the world were built from timber that came out of those camps. The newspapers that informed the nation were printed on paper, made from trees that hand loggers had felled. By 1900, the United States was consuming more lumber per capita than any nation in history, and the men who cut it were the invisible army that made everything else possible. Then the machines came. The chainsaw was invented in Germany in the 1920s, but the first models were curiosities. They weighed over 100 pounds. They required 2 men to operate, one holding each end. They broke down constantly, spraying oil and throwing chains. They were louder than anything the forest had ever heard, and they vibrated so violently that operators suffered nerve damage in their hands and arms within months of starting to use them. The early logging companies looked at these machines and laughed. Why would you replace a good sawyer team with an unreliable, expensive, dangerous piece of equipment that couldn't do the job as well? The crosscut saw had been perfected over centuries. It was quiet, reliable, and it didn't need gasoline or spare parts or mechanics to keep it running. But the engineers kept working, and the war changed everything. World War II created a demand for lumber that the existing workforce couldn't meet. Young men who would have gone into the camps went into the military instead. The companies that supplied timber for ships and barracks and rifle stocks needed more production with fewer workers. For the first time, efficiency wasn't just desirable, it was essential. By 1945, the two-man chainsaw had been refined into something almost practical. It still weighed 80 to 100 pounds. It still required two operators. It still broke down regularly and required constant maintenance, but it could cut through a tree in a fraction of the time a crosscut saw took. The first saws appeared in the big company camps in the Pacific Northwest around 1946. The old sawyers watched them with skepticism. The noise was unbearable, a roar that drowned out every other sound in the forest. The saws threw oil and sawdust everywhere, coating the operators in a film of grease and wood chips. They broke down constantly, and when they did, there was no one within 100 miles who knew how to fix them. But they were faster. That was undeniable. A two-man chainsaw team could fell twice as many trees per day as a crosscut team. In an industry where profit margins were measured in board feet per man per day, that difference was everything. The crosscut saws didn't disappear overnight. For years, both methods existed side by side. And some camps used chainsaws for the big trees and crosscuts for the smaller ones. Some sawyers refused to touch the machines, and foremen who valued their skills let them work the old way. Some companies couldn't afford the new equipment and kept doing things the way they'd always been done. But the transition had begun, and everyone knew it. The men who used crosscuts could see their future in the roar of those engines. They could hear it coming like a train in the distance, too far away to see, but close enough to feel. Then came the one-man saw. In 1952, McCulloch introduced the Model 47, a chainsaw that weighed 25 pounds and could be operated by a single man. It wasn't perfect. It was still loud, still prone to breakdown, still required constant maintenance and adjustment. But for the first time, one worker could do the job that had always required two. The math was brutal. A company that employed 100 two-man crosscut teams could now employ 50 men with chainsaws and get the same production. But why stop there? With proper training, those 50 men could actually produce more than the original 100. The economics were irresistible. The displacement began. It happened differently in different places. In the Pacific Northwest, the big companies moved first. Weyerhaeuser and Georgia-Pacific and Crown Zellerbach bought chainsaws by the thousands and retrained their younger workers. The older men, the ones who'd been felling timber for 20 or 30 years, found themselves facing a choice: learn the new way or leave. Many of them couldn't learn. It wasn't stubbornness, it wasn't pride, it was something deeper. And the chainsaw required different skills, different muscles, different timing. A crosscut saw was a conversation with the tree, a negotiation conducted through wood and steel. A chainsaw was an assault. Men who'd spent decades developing one set of instincts found those instincts working against them. The vibration was the first thing they noticed. A crosscut saw transmitted information through the handles, subtle feedback about the wood and the cut. A chainsaw transmitted nothing but violence. The engine screamed at a frequency that penetrated the skull. The chain chattered against the wood in a way that felt wrong, destructive, out of control. Men who'd prided themselves on precision found themselves wrestling with a machine that had no interest in precision. And then there was the noise. The old growth forests had been quiet places. Despite the work, you could hear birds and wind and the creak of trees. You could hear your partner breathe. You could hear danger coming. The chainsaw ended all of that. It was so loud that operators couldn't hear anything else. They couldn't hear warning shouts. They couldn't hear the crack of a tree beginning to fall. They had to rely on sight alone, and sight wasn't enough. Men died because they couldn't hear the things that would have saved them. Earl Wilcox, the man I mentioned at the beginning, tried to learn. He told an interviewer in 1979 that he'd borrowed a chainsaw from a younger man and spent a weekend practicing on fallen timber. But his hands shook too much. The vibration traveled up his arms and into his shoulders and reminded him of everything he was losing. He put the saw down and never picked it up again. He was far from alone. The displacement accelerated through the 1950s. By 1960, the crosscut saw had virtually disappeared from commercial logging operations in the United States. The men who'd use them had three options: retrain, retire, or find other work. Many retrained. The younger ones, especially, adapted to the chainsaws and later to the heavy equipment that would transform logging even more dramatically. But adaptation meant more than learning new skills. It meant accepting a different relationship with the work itself. A chainsaw operator didn't read a tree. He cut it. The saw did the thinking. The operator just pointed it in the right direction and pulled the trigger. The partnership between man and tree was over. The knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate, the ability to read grain and lean and tension, so all of it became obsolete in the span of a decade. Some of the old-timers couldn't accept this. They found work as consultants and trainers, passing on knowledge that the new generation neither needed nor wanted. They became museum guides and oral historians, telling stories to people who would never understand what it felt like to pull a crosscut through old-growth Douglas fir. They wrote letters to newspapers and gave interviews to researchers, trying to preserve something of what they'd known before it vanished entirely. The oral history projects of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s captured some of what would otherwise have been lost. Researchers with tape recorders sat in living rooms and nursing homes, listening to old men describe a world that no longer existed. The recordings are still there. In university, archives, and historical societies, voices of the dead speaking across decades. They talked about the smell of the camps, the taste of camp coffee, the feel of a saw handle worn smooth by use. They talked about the men they'd worked with, the ones who'd died and the ones who'd survived. They talked about the forests themselves, trees so big that you couldn't see the top, groves so thick that noon looked like twilight. And they talked about what it felt like to watch it all end. The confusion, the anger, the sense of being discarded after giving everything they had. One man, interviewed in 1978, described the feeling as being fired from your own life. He'd been a logger for 37 years. When the work ended, he didn't know who he was anymore. They lived longer than the work they'd done. They watched the forests they'd logged become parks and wilderness areas. They watched the tools they'd used become antiques. And they wondered whether everything they'd sacrificed had been worth it. The chainsaws were just the beginning. Through the 1950s and 1960s, mechanization transformed every aspect of logging. Caterpillar tractors replaced the horses and oxen that had dragged logs to the rivers. The D-Series cats could move logs that would have required 20 horses, and they didn't tire, didn't spook, didn't need to be fed and watered and rested. The animals that had been partners in the work, the heavy draft horses that knew their jobs as well as any man, were sold off to farms and slaughterhouses. Some teamsters bought their own horses and tried to keep them, but you can't feed a draft horse on sentiment. The animals went where the work was, and the work was gone. The men who'd worked with those horses lost more than a job. They lost a relationship. A good teamster knew his horses by name, knew their personalities, knew exactly how much weight they could pull and how long they could work before they needed rest. The horses knew their teamsters just as well. They'd save men's lives, sensing danger before the men did, refusing to move when a log was about to roll, pulling injured workers out of tight spots where no machine could reach. All of that was gone by 1965. The tractors were faster, stronger, and didn't need to rest. They didn't die when a log rolled over them. They didn't leave widows and orphans when they were crushed in the woods. They didn't need feed or veterinary care or someone to brush them down at the end of the day. But they also didn't care. The relationship between man and machine was purely functional. The tractor was a tool, nothing more. The work became lonelier. A man alone on a cat, dragging logs through the mud, had no one to talk to but himself. Then came the trucks. For 100 years, rivers had been the highways of the logging industry. Logs cut in the winter were piled on riverbanks, waiting for the spring floods. When the water rose, the log drives began. Millions of board feet of timber floating downstream, guided by river drivers who walked on the moving logs with spiked boots and long poles. River driving was the most dangerous job in logging, which is saying something. The logs rolled constantly. They jammed up against each other and against the rocks, creating log jams that could stretch for miles. Breaking a jam meant finding the key log, the one holding everything in place, and removing it. Often that meant standing on the jam itself, prying with a pike pole, while thousands of tons of timber waited to explode downstream. Men died on the rivers every spring. They drowned. They were crushed between logs. They fell from the jams and were swept under and never found. Their bodies sometimes turned up miles downstream. Weeks or months later, unrecognizable except by the caulked boots still strapped to their feet. But the rivers were free. You didn't have to build roads to them. You didn't have to maintain them. Gravity and water did the work. The economics of logging had been built around the rivers for generations, and the rivers had never asked for wages or complained about working conditions. Trucks changed everything. The logging trucks of the 1950s could carry loads that would have required days of river driving. They could operate year-round, not just during the spring floods. They could reach timber in areas where there were no rivers at all, and they were getting bigger and more capable every year. The last major log drive in the United States took place on the Penobscot River in Maine in 1976. By then, it was an anachronism, a nostalgic gesture more than an economic necessity. The river drivers who participated were old men, coming back for one final run, their balance not what it used to be, their reflexes slower, but their pride intact. The television cameras recorded it as history. And it was history. A way of working that had shaped the American landscape for 2 centuries was over. The rivers still flow through the forests, but they flow alone now. No one walks on the logs anymore. No one shouts commands over the roar of the rapids. No one dies in the spring floods trying to break a jam. The logging towns died next. They'd been built to serve the industry. Sawmills and bunkhouses and general stores and saloons, all clustered around the timber that was the reason for their existence. When the timber was gone, or when the work moved to machines that didn't need to sleep in bunkhouses or drink in saloons, the towns died too. I want you to understand what that means. These weren't ghost towns in the romantic sense, the kind you see in westerns with tumbleweeds rolling down empty streets. They were communities where people had raised families and built churches and buried their dead. They had schools and baseball teams and 4th of July parades. They had histories and traditions and futures that people believed in. And then they were gone. Cascadia, Oregon, had a population of 800 in 1950. By 1970, it was under 200. By 1990, it wasn't even incorporated anymore. The school closed because there weren't enough children to justify a teacher. The church closed because there weren't enough people to fill the pews. The general store closed because there weren't enough customers to pay the rent. The people who could leave, left. The people who couldn't stayed and watched everything they'd known disappear around them. There were hundreds of towns like Cascadia, some in Oregon and Washington, some in Northern California, some in the Great Lakes states, where the white pine forests had been cut over so thoroughly that nothing remained but stumps and memories. Each one had its own story, its own slow collapse, its own people who remember what it used to be like before the machines came and the work went away. The economists call this structural unemployment. They have charts and graphs that show how labor markets adjust and workers relocate and new industries emerge to replace old ones. The charts don't show the families that split up because one parent found work somewhere else and the other couldn't bear to leave. They don't show the teenagers who left and never came back because there was nothing to come back to. They don't show the old-timers who refused to leave, who stayed in dying towns because that's where their lives had been, and who died there alone. The adjustment period, the economists say, is always temporary. But temporary can be a lifetime if you're the one living through it. Something else happened in those years, something that the loggers didn't see coming and wouldn't have understood if they had. America started to look at what it had done. The conservation movement had been building for decades, but it had always been a minority concern. Teddy Roosevelt had created the national forests. The Civilian Conservation Corps had planted trees during the Depression. But most Americans, if they thought about forests at all, thought of them as resources. Trees were lumber. Lumber was progress. Progress was good. The mechanization of logging changed this. Not because the machines were inherently worse for the forests. If anything, they were more efficient. They could cut more timber with less waste. They could reach areas that had been inaccessible to hand loggers. But efficiency meant speed. And speed meant that forests that had taken centuries to grow could be cleared in years. The scale of the cutting became visible in a way it had never been before. The satellite photographs started appearing in the 1960s. For the first time, Americans could see the forests from above. They could see the checkerboard pattern of clear cuts spreading across the Pacific Northwest, like some kind of disease. They could see the brown scars on the green mountains. They could see what progress looked like from space. The reaction was slow at first, but it built. Rachel Carson published Silent Spring in 1962, and although it was about pesticides, it was also about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The Wilderness Act passed in 1964. The National Environmental Policy Act passed in 1969. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970. The loggers watched all of this with confusion and anger. They'd spent their lives providing something that America needed. They'd risked their lives and sacrificed their health and lost their friends in the woods. And now America was telling them that what they'd done was wrong? It wasn't that simple, of course. Nothing is ever that simple. The logging companies had been wasteful. They'd taken the best trees and left the rest to rot. They'd logged hillsides too steep to regenerate. They'd dumped sawdust and slash into rivers and killed the salmon runs. The sins were real, even if the sinners didn't see themselves as sinners. But the men on the ground, the ones who'd actually done the cutting, felt betrayed. They'd done what they were told. They'd done what the country needed. And now they were being blamed for decisions that had been made by men in offices who'd never spent a day in the woods. The spotted owl controversy in the 1990s was the final chapter. By then, most of the old hand loggers were dead or retired, but their sons and grandsons were still in the industry, running chainsaws and heavy equipment, doing work that had become more mechanized and less dangerous, and they felt less respected. When the federal government listed the northern spotted owl as a threatened species and restricted logging on millions of acres of federal land, the remaining timber communities exploded. Bumper stickers appeared that said things like, "Save a logger," "Eat an owl," and "I love spotted owls," fried. The rhetoric was ugly, born of desperation and fear. What the loggers didn't understand, what perhaps they couldn't understand, was that the world had changed. The old-growth forests they'd grown up cutting were almost gone. The big trees that had taken 500 years to grow had been cut in a generation. What remained was second growth and third growth, trees that were smaller and less valuable and would never reach the size of the originals. The concept of old growth didn't even exist until the 1970s. Before that, big trees were just trees. They were resources. They were there to be cut. The idea that they might have value simply standing, simply existing, was foreign to men who'd spent their lives turning them into lumber. But the idea took hold. And as it did, the logging industry contracted, not because of regulations alone, not because of environmentalists alone, but because the trees were gone. You can't log a forest that doesn't exist anymore. Today, the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest employs a fraction of what it did in 1960. The work that remains is almost entirely mechanized. A single operator in a harvester can do the work of 20 men with chainsaws. The camps are gone. The bunkhouses are gone. The cookhouses that serve 4,000 calories a day are gone. The company towns are gone. What remains? are the tools. They show up at estate sales and antique shops, cross-cut saws with rusted blades and handles worn smooth by decades of use, double-bit axes with chips in the steel where they struck a hidden nail or a rock in the bark, pike poles that guided logs down rivers that haven't seen a log drive in 50 years, caulked boots with spikes worn down to nothing. The people who buy these things rarely know what they're holding. They hang the saws on walls and put the axes in gardens as decorations. They don't know the names of the men who use them. They don't know the stories. They see antiques, curiosities, conversation pieces. They don't see lives. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you find someone who does. I spoke to a woman in Spokane who has her grandfather's crosscut saw in her garage. She's 74 years old. Her grandfather died in 1961, the year she was born. She never met him, but she knows his story because her father told it to her, over and over, until she could recite it like a prayer. His name was Anders Lindgren. He came from Sweden in 1902 when he was 16 years old, with nothing but the clothes on his back and an address of a cousin who'd come over 5 years earlier. He worked in the timber camps of Washington State for 43 years. He could fall a tree within 6 inches of where he intended. He could sharpen a saw until it sang through the wood. He lost 2 fingers to frostbite in the winter of 1918 and never complained. Never used it as an excuse. Never let it slow him down. He died of emphysema, probably from years of breathing sawdust and wood smoke, but he died at home, in a bed, surrounded by his family. He'd outlived dozens of men he'd worked with, men who'd been crushed by trees or drowned in rivers or killed in the 1,000 other ways the woods could kill you. He considered himself lucky. His granddaughter keeps the saw because she doesn't know what else to do with it. She can't throw it away. It weighs too much, has too much history, to be discarded like garbage. I'm in an antique shop. Someone will buy it in an antique shop. Someone will buy it and hang it on their wall, and they'll have no idea. They'll think it's just an old saw. But it's not. It's my grandfather's whole life. She's right, of course, and she's wrong. It's not just her grandfather's life. It's the life of an industry, a culture, a way of being in the world that no longer exists. The hand loggers built this country. They cleared the land for farms and cities. They provided the lumber for houses and ships and railroad ties. They opened the forests that would later become national parks. They did the hardest, most dangerous work that America had to offer, and most of them died poor, worn out by labor that took everything they had to give. They deserved better than they got. They deserved recognition and respect, and some acknowledgement that their sacrifice meant something. Instead, they got unemployment and displacement, and eventually blame for environmental destruction that was driven by corporate decisions and consumer demand, not by the men on the ground with axes in their hands. The machines that replaced them weren't evil. They were just machines. They did what machines do. They made the work faster and cheaper and less dangerous. They saved lives if you count the injuries and deaths that didn't happen because there were fewer men in the woods doing dangerous work. But they also ended something. They ended a way of working that had defined American labor for generations. They ended a relationship between men and trees that had been built on knowledge and skill and physical strength. They ended communities and families and traditions that had been passed down from father to son. What replaced them was efficiency, productivity, profit margins, the things that matter on spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Not bad things, necessarily, but not the same things, not the things that make a life meaningful. If you're listening to this and you remember the old ways, if you watched your father or your grandfather walk away from the woods, if you have a crosscut saw in your garage that you can't throw away, I want you to know something. It mattered. All of it mattered. The work, the sacrifice, the skill, the knowledge. It built something, even if what it built has changed so much that you barely recognize it. And if you're younger, if you've never seen a crosscut saw except in a museum, I want you to understand something too. The world you live in was built by men like Earl Wilcox and Anders Lindgren. Men whose names are not in any history books. Men who worked and bled and sometimes died in forests that don't exist anymore. Men who asked for nothing except a fair wage for an honest day's work and a chance to go home to their families at the end of the season. They didn't get statues. They didn't get holidays. They got forgotten. But the trees remember. The stumps of the old-growth giants still rot in the Pacific Northwest forests. If you know where to look, you can find them. You can put your hand on wood that was cut by men who are long dead and imagine what it must have been like, the kerf of the saw, the smell of the sawdust. The sound of timber echoing through the trees, the ground shaking when 500 years of growth hit the earth. The silence afterward, when the birds were gone and the dust was settling and two men stood there breathing hard, looking at what they'd done. All gone now, all of it gone. But not entirely. Not as long as someone tells the story. Not as long as someone remembers. Earl Wilcox's great-granddaughter lives in Boise now. She's a software engineer. She's never been in a logging camp, never held a crosscut saw, never smelled the particular smell of fresh-cut Douglas fir. But she knows her great-grandfather's name. She knows what he did. She knows that the house she grew up in was built from lumber that men like him cut from forests that men like him destroyed. It's a complicated inheritance. All inheritance is complicated. We live in a world built by people who couldn't imagine us, and we will be forgotten by people we can't imagine. That's the deal. That's the price of being human. But maybe if we're lucky, maybe if we pay attention, we can hold on to something. Some fragment of knowledge, some scrap of respect, some acknowledgement that the people who came before us were real, that they had names and families and dreams, that they worked harder than most of us will ever work, that they built the foundations we stand on. They were real. The hand loggers were real. They lived and worked and died in forests that we'll never see. They had names and families and stories that deserved to be told. They deserved better, and they didn't get it. This is what I can offer them. This story. This remembrance. This attempt to put into words what it meant to be a hand logger in America, and what it meant when the machines came, and what was lost when 5,000 men walked out of the woods and never came back. The saws are in the antique shops now. The axes are in the museums. The men are in the cemeteries, if they're anywhere at all.